Good morning. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So, welcome to DeepSec. This is the 8th DeepSec this year. We hope that you enjoy the next 2 days of talks. We already had 2 days of workshops. We tried to do the best since we received so many submissions for this year that we could have been easily doing 6 days of conference. But unfortunately, we had to make a selection. As you notice from the schedule, we have some interesting topics. We also have a speaker who wishes to remain anonymous until his talk, of course. We have talks about hardware, backdoors, hypervisors. We have a lot of IPv6 content. So we hope you enjoy the coming 2 days and our talks. Yeah, thanks for joining me.
Hello, good morning, everybody. We're so glad that you came back. There's many recurring guests. Thank you for coming. And this year we are very glad to have the guests from US again. I don't know what happened. For 2 years we didn't have a single booking from US. Now they're back again. Thank you. We almost thought we are on a blacklist or something like that. Apparently not. So this is a great relief. So for the conference, did you mention Wi-Fi? No. Yeah, okay. We have wireless LAN for you prepared. It's free and it's for self-defending, which means no security in the LAN. That's your job. Anything else? Oh, yes. We do have a little thing. Deep Intel will be in spring next year. We had to move away from autumn. It was a little bit of... Oh, Deep Intel, yes. We are doing another conference, a small conference, which is a closed-door conference, vetting process, white hat only, which means I have to get rid of my hat. And it's about security intelligence. And target audience would be mainly public administration, critical infrastructure, finance industry, to exchange about security intelligence. It's a sponsor-free event, and it's all-inclusive. So if you're interested, stay tuned.
And the dates are the 4th and the 5th of May next year. It's a 2-day event, single track. So either if you're interested in joining or if you're interested in presenting a talk, you're welcome. Contact us, and we're working on the schedule right now. So in the coming 2 months, we will publish the speakers. Title only, abstracts and everything else is non-public.
Yes, and I think it's now time for Alex Hutton.
Thanks. Good morning. Whoa. Good morning. My name is Alex Hutton, and I will vouch for Deep Intel. I was fortunate enough to go to one a little while back. Fantastic situation if you're like me and you deal in critical infrastructure. So I take it that this isn't on. So while we wait for that to warm up a bit here, I'll go into a little bit about my background. My name is Alex Hutton, and I currently work for, in the United States, the smallest of the 2 big to fail banks. And so we are a member of the US critical infrastructure. There I work in information security, where I own and operate a handful of organizations. One is our ITGRC organization. The other is our information assurance organization, so vulnerability management, red team, security testing, integration with application security, as well as application development and quality assurance. I also are responsible for our security engineering and operations team, so our firewalls, our VPNs, the network equipment associated with that. So that's my role. Prior to that, I worked in something fantastic called operational risk. Any banks in the audience? A handful? Yay, op risk, no. If you're familiar with the Basel Accord and what banks have to do, it's very much structured along that line. Part of that, I worked for a company called Verizon. While I was at Verizon, I was part of a team that did the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. Has anybody read the Verizon report? A few hands, okay, great. Yeah, so I was part of a team that was responsible for that. We'll go a little bit into that here today as we talk about this. Prior to that, I worked with an organization that did basically helped financial institutions in the United States and a couple of manufacturing institutions in the EU set up their information risk management and in some cases enterprise risk management programs. So a lot of focus on security and risk governance there. Worked with the Open Group in helping establish an international standard. That was a lot of fun. Prior to that, I worked for an organization that did penetration testing and some risk assessment for a lot of the US's largest credit unions, some of their critical infrastructure, Department of Energy, nuclear weapons, nuclear power labs. Prior to that, I ran a small e-commerce site. That was before the 2001 bubble burst. And prior to that, security product management and security engineering, but now, as I tell my US audiences, you're in the Clinton administration and I already feel old. Today's topic I wanted to talk to you about is called the Measured CSO. And the deep intel that I was fortunate enough to attend a few years back, we talked a little bit about what my organization does with threat intel, how we process it and so forth. And it's, Renee and Mika asked me to come back and talk to you guys a little bit about that, a little bit about how our CSO views the world, because he uses measures and so forth beyond just actionable threat intel that comes in. And I think it's an important topic, so I appreciate you taking time and letting me talk about what my team calls my management arts and crafts today. So the Measured CSO. I thought we'd go into a little bit of a background. I already did who am I while we were waiting for the projector to warm up here. But I thought we'd talk about where we are as an industry for a little bit. Kind of what we're good at, what we're not good at, mainly what we're not good at. What is a CSO? Right? How many people work for a Chief Information Security Officer or Chief Security Officer? 4 people, 5 people? The rest are consultants. They're going to be swamping you guys for business cards in just a bit. So let's talk about the role of the CSO. What do they do? What is success? How do they get there? And then what does it mean to become measured? So section 1, we already talked a little bit about who I am. Some of this stuff didn't mention my work in FAIR directly. So anybody familiar with the factor analysis of information risk? It's a Bayesian belief network. No? Okay, that's fine. It's an open group standard. You can go find it on their website and so forth. What is this topic? Why the Measured CSO? So I'll start with measurement badass Lord Kelvin. Lord Kelvin is basically famous for saying, if you can't measure something, you're going to have a tough time knowing about it. Right? This is why we have large busts of the gentleman around. And so what I see this talk and where we are as an industry is the journey towards knowledge. Certainly before the Verizon DBIR, we had a very difficult time describing what we were looking at sometimes. For one of Florida's largest credit unions, in fact, one of the top 10 corporate credit unions in America, I remember sitting and presenting to their executive council. And I had the CISO, they had a brand new chief risk officer, so a CRO, a CFO, the CIO, and the CEO all in the room, right? And kind of a big deal for US regulations. You have to sit with all these people, waste their time, and talk about security. It's not really a waste of time, but you get my picture. And so we're presenting our findings, and we'll just call it a finding amongst us, right? You do a penetration test, you get a couple of findings, you sit there and you talk to the client about it. This was very uncomfortable. The CISO, she said, well, that's a vulnerability. The CFO said, that's definitely a threat. The CRO, right, he said, well, that's a risk. And the CEO said, fix it, right? Now, ultimately, they got what needed to get done. But you see how we had several different phrases used to describe the same semantic object, right? And that confusion has existed for some time, right? So let's talk a little bit about where we are as an industry in the context of this journey for knowledge. So we talked about measurement badass Lord Kelvin. This is security badass Dan Geer. If you haven't read Dan Geer, you're not familiar with Dan Geer, or had the pleasure of drinking with Dan Geer, he's a blast and he's just incredibly smart. And he's also wonderful at understating things like this, right? We're at a point where we can't talk about things in high, medium, or low, right? Anybody here ever discuss profits of your company? Right? How would you feel if you went up to your CFO or your investors went up to your CFO and said, hey, how are we on profitability? And they said, well, profitability is medium. We have medium profitability this month. That's a yellow dot, right? So I think Dan's right here. We have to start talking about numbers. Unfortunately, if Lord Kelvin will tell us that science is based on deriving meanings from observations, actually going through scientific rigor, we have to ask ourselves, where does information security sit in the family of sciences, right? The answer is not good. In the family of sciences, we're knucking futs, right? We are just in a very difficult position of trying to describe what we do with any accuracy, or worse yet, any repeatability. Take, for example, CVSS. Anybody in here use CVSS? I'm about to bash it. I use it every day. I still use it. So I got this straight from CVSS and kind of the instructions, how they show you how to do it. It says the base equation multiplies impact by 0.6 and exploitability by 0.4. These assigned numbers. Right? I have a gentleman nodding his head. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Unfortunately, you're multiplying ordinal scales, which is the logical equivalent of saying jet engine times peanut butter equals shiny, right? That's what we do. And we're surprised when the business says, this doesn't make any sense, I'm not going to fix this. One other thing that's awesome about this is the 0.6 and the 0.4. Right? I'm here to tell you, decimals aren't unicorn turds. They're not magical. Just because you apply a decimal in front of something doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to turn it into a ratio scale and be able to do mathematical functions like multiplication. The universe doesn't work that way, okay? And you can ask yourself, am I dealing with silly math nonsense in security if you can add a 0 before or after the 6 and the 4, and it doesn't make any difference in your outcome. No magnitude of difference in the outcome. In this case, 2.4, 0.24, 240, it just doesn't matter, right, what we're looking at. There's no magnitude. The decimal is relatively random. So again, security badass Dan Geer says, we are in a very difficult position as an industry. We can only describe things in terms of preference, how we feel about them in an ordinal value. And if you study the philosophy of science badass Tom Kuhn, he, I think, describes where we sit in the context of what he calls a proto-science. So Thomas Kuhn was a philosopher of science, and he talked about how something gets from kind of mysticism and religion to science. Right? And he has a lot of works on this. You can argue whether he's right or wrong, but I think this is fantastic. Somewhat random fact gathering, mainly of readily accessible data. What's your metrics program look like? A morass of interesting, trivial, and irrelevant observations. A variety of theories that provide little guidance into data gathering. Does this sound like your standards that we have to abide by, or international standards, what we're fed as an industry, what I have to manage to, right? And I manage in arts and crafts. Where we are is definitely somewhere uncomfortable, but I think we're doing a better job, especially over the last 6 or 7 years. How did we get here? Well, it's a tragedy of a couple of mistakes in my mind. All right? The first mistake, I'm very familiar with, because right out of school I joined one of the first internet service providers in the United States, and they said, gee, Alex, you know what a T3 is. That's great. We're going to now ask you to learn about those firewall things and tell people why they need a firewall. Convince people to spend $50,000 instead of $3,000 for a Cisco 2600 router. And so we went, oh, this is network engineering. Security is a part of these layers. And we started talking to customers, making presentations, and suddenly there was this new stateful packet inspection thing, or dynamic firewalls, or whatever they called them in those days, right? And we approached security as a piece of this layer. When I worked at Verizon, the reason they bought CyberTrust was because they're like, oh, well, CyberTrust is just another layer up there. We own a bunch of these layers. Let's own another piece of the layer, right? Corporate acquisition by OSI model. The SOA guys remixed this, and some people attribute individual organization and government, the top layers, to Bruce Schneier. I'm not going to get into a fight of who said what and when, but the SOA people remixed this to look like this, right? Mika and I are having drinks the other night, and I actually like what he suggested. His remix is changing that to religion at the operator layer. And if you're familiar with my auditors, I do sacrifice chickens before every audit. Second mistake is the blind leading the blind. We have a handful of blind men that we'll talk to you about how we got here. First is the FUD factory. Let's take an example of mobile versus web to describe the FUD factory. So this is non-scientific. This is just Google trends. If you're familiar with going to Google, you put in a couple phrases and you compare how popular they are in terms of headlines and so forth. The red is web security. The blue is mobile malware. So you can tell people used to care about web security, but now they don't. And people really care about mobile malware these days. Well, if you take a look at the data breach investigations report, especially the last year where they started putting patterns of common attacks into something that you could actually use to stop a kill chain with, you've got a handful of things here. One specifically, web applications, that really matters in terms of actually defending an enterprise or a network. And in fact, they'll even break it out for you in terms of financial services versus other industries, or if you're in manufacturing or whatever in your industry. In my industry, web attacks are nearly 30%, or 30% of all data breaches. Right, we got DOS is 30%, another 20% on card skimmers. Kind of a big deal in the US, because for whatever reason, chip and pin is a mystery to us. But web attacks are huge. Well, what does the DBIR say about mobile? Because remember, mobile's a big deal, right? These are the headlines. It's all about the mobile. Yeah, it's actually down there, right? Now, don't get me wrong. They say in the language that it's actually a great big deal. The wonderful people at the Dutch High-Tech Crime Unit, if you haven't met those individuals, they're a fantastic team. Had an opportunity to spend a day with them, very impressed. And they'll talk about how criminals are attacking consumers with mobile malware, and they're being very successful about this. And if you are familiar with operational risk as a bank or what have you, you'll know that that's a big element of fraud. But they also go on to say that mobile doesn't even move the needle when it comes to a data breach. It doesn't. But yet I get 6, 7, 8 spam emails a week from people who want to help me secure all the mobile devices in my organization, right? Because it's in all the headlines. The FUD factory contributes to waste, contributes to us being a relatively rudderless. Without this data, we would not have context to know that mobile malware is a big deal for our consumers, perhaps, not a big deal in terms of spending to prevent a data breach compared to, say, web applications. Blind Man 2, accounting consultancy industrial complex. Anybody remember these devices? They were great back in the day. I had a couple. So when part of the DBIR team was first acquired by Verizon, They were given these things. And before that, they were a small company and they had their own loosey-goosey security standards. When they got to Verizon, the only way you could unlock these things was by standard that audit was enforcing that said basically you have to have a special character, right? So you're gonna have to do shift on the tiny keys, and then you have to have 8 characters, and then you have to have a number in that and a capital letter and all that stuff, right? Strong password. Fantastic. Well, being the smart asses that the DBIR team is, they actually figured out that you're more likely to kill a Verizon employee in a car accident by them trying to open their phone while they're driving than have a data breach based on a simple 2-character password. Anybody want to guess whether or not audit repealed the standard for strong password? Yeah, of course not, right? You know, forget the lives and the safety, we're going to cover our butts. But part of what they didn't realize is that they're dealing with a complex system, right? That you're going to poke a system someplace, and all of a sudden something completely unintended is going to come out the other side. And if you're familiar with complexity theory, I won't bore you with the details, except to say that Chill and Frederick Hayek here says you're doing it wrong. You can't make point predictions in a complex system. And whether you believe Hayek or not is up to you, your philosophies on economics, but there are a lot of people who tend to wonder if we can make these predictions that we do in our risk registers. Blind man number 3, we already had a basic introduction to. Just to pile on, and Steve Christie, I love him, good friend, don't get me wrong, I'm not out bashing him, I'm actually doing it because I trust that, because I've had conversations with him, been on panels at DEF CON, he knows part of the problems. But so this is CVSS, and this is a data scientist who works for a company called Risk.io named Mike Reutman. And anybody seen Mike's research based on vulnerabilities and exploits? Okay, if you haven't, you might want to check it out. Because what Mike did was Mike went and looked at vulnerabilities, and then he looked at incidents. And then he said, well, how do I know if I should care about a vulnerability or not based on something simple like, oh, the outcome basically being a compromise? And what he found out was this. If you used Metasploit and Exploit DB, and you could say a vulnerability has an exploit in here, based on his data set, there's a 30% chance-ish, right, that you're looking at a probability of exploit. Metasploit alone, a little less. Exploit DB, a little less. CVSS of 10. Mind you, that's 10. That's the worst you can possibly score something. CVSS is not like Spinal Tap. It doesn't go to 11, right? So CVSS of 10, barely 5 or 6%. In fact, his research said that if you have a CVSS of 9 or below, it's random noise whether or not that vulnerability is going to actually be shown to be exploited in the wild in his data set. We have broken models about how we describe things. So I'm talking to you today about this topic to tell you a CSO must become measured in order to escape what we've been doing in the past and push us into the future, because it's only going to get worse. So let's talk about the role of the CSO. What do we think of when we think about a CSO? Right? Maybe we think about a general. Right? Maybe we think about somebody who's standing out there against the bad guys, and measured CSO. Well, rather than thinking about a measured CSO in terms of a Kurosawa-based samurai, anybody familiar with the Akira Kurosawa films? If you're not, they're wonderful films. I actually think that the measured CSO is more like Kurosawa's films where Toshiro Mifune actually played an industrialist, a CEO, a salaryman, or something like that. And I think the measured CEO is much more apt in this model because the measured CSO is going to know about W. Edwards Deming. Anybody know about Dr. Deming? Okay, a couple folks, great. Right, so he's the father of total quality management, and this is a quote, inspiration that drove Japanese post-war economic miracle, which is actually a Wikipedia entry, post-war economic miracle. I'll tell you it's no miracle. And some people will tell you that all Deming did was teach the Japanese to manage based on fact. Right? So I'd like to take a second and read to you. And I know might not be the most entertaining thing. I won't do soft shoe with it. But this is what a guy named Myron Tribus, and Myron is famous for being a father of thermodynamics, founded thermoeconomics, dean at MIT, Dartmouth, and so forth. Also a contemporary of Deming's and switched from physics and quantum mechanics towards management science, mainly because he was so thrilled. And Deming writes about, Tribus writes about Deming, and he writes about a mythical truck company and how a Deming-based manager would fare. So first, the manager of at the truck company realizes that the potentials for improving the system are never ending. So he does not call on consultants to teach him how to redesign the best system because he knows it doesn't exist. Any system can be continuously improved on. Does anybody have a system, a network, that always has vulnerabilities to some degree in it? If you're not raising your hand, you're silly. He knows that the only people who really know where the potentials for improvement lie are the workers themselves. He knows that the system is subject to great variability. My patch management stats and my vulnerability management stats change rapidly from month to month. Traffic conditions change, trucks break down, shipping docks are not always ready to discharge or receive goods, mistakes are made in routing and addressing. There are countless ways for the system to go wrong and out of control, decrease in quality, increase in cost. He knows that these things occur randomly. That's back to that Hayek quote that we talked about a little bit. To make it possible for him and the workers to work together, he knows they must regard the system in the same way and speak a common language. Here's where it gets interesting. Therefore, he learns elementary statistics. He teaches it to the workers, engaging an expert consultant in statistics if necessary to help him and the workers when they come to a problem beyond their elementary statistics. All of his employees learn to keep their own statistics. Truck drivers keep track of how long they have to wait at docks and study the circumstances at each event. They develop their own control charts, look for trends, correlations with other events, usually events that are beyond their control. Drivers meet with each other and sometimes even the dispatcher and others to compare notes. They keep data on performance, their trucks, they discuss their statistical charts with the purchasing agent and with each other. Based on the data, the manager who is responsible for the systems makes changes, and the workers, based on their statistical information, help him to learn how effective the changes have been. When the manager instructs the purchasing agent to buy on quality, not just on cost, the purchasing agent has the information from the drivers themselves with which to do just that and to demonstrate that he has done so. Everyone in the system is involved in studying it and proposing how to improve it. Everyone spends about 5% of their time in this pursuit. How many security people in here are actual security practitioners? Actually, I'll strike that. I don't care if you're a marketer, I don't care if you're in sales, I don't care if you're a consultant. How many people spend 2 hours of their week doing statistics on what they've done the other 38 hours? 2, 3, a handful of us. This is perfect, right? So some items, and improvements to the system are never ending, right? Andrew Jaquith described vulnerability management and other things as the hamster wheel of pain. You get on it and you never get off, and you're this hamster always going, right? The only people who know where the real potentials for improvement are the workers. It's not your operational risk committee, right? It's not the enterprise risk management committee. The people who know where you're going to improve IT are the workers themselves. The system is always changing. There are countless ways for the system to go wrong. If these bullets don't speak to you about modern networks, right, I don't know what's going to. Statistics and metrics are used to focus the conversation on fact and improvement. Goals for quality are cross-silo. We heard about the workers working with a purchasing agent and with the guy on the dock and so forth, right? Some of us do engage with IT, right? But how many people have really good security in this SDLC of your organization? Theories for improvement are implemented and tested. Management uses workers as essential instruments in understanding what is. That last one's a key. So for a measured CSO, what we're doing is relying on metrics for decisions and knowledge, right? They're investing in the improvements to their workforce, the people, the processes, and the technologies. They're putting innovation for improvements to the system in the hands of that operator, ensuring that there's a feedback loop for effectiveness and initiatives. And this last one is my management arts and crafts, works tirelessly with the bureaucracy. Right. So their mission, to provide the best and least cost security for the shareholders, and this is important, right? And mind you, Deming, Tribus, these guys are all American born and bred capitalists. It is the continuity of employment for his workers. Two notes on this definition. First, this is what Deming would say is the goal of the CSO as a manager, right? I'm just basically taking his definition of manager and I added a little security dust to it, right? We as an industry know that best and least costs are not necessarily contradictory. Anybody use open source? Yeah, right? We also have a huge continuity issue. So I won't make sweeping generalizations about my observations about US audiences for Europe, but this will be fun. How many people in here who have held a job at a corporation, i.e. not you as an individual consultant, but held a job at a corporation for longer than 5 years? A handful of folks. In the US, the average CSO has a lifespan of just over 24 months. It's impossible to get continuity when we have that level of turnover. Impossible. So, let's talk about using metrics to improve the system, right? What is that system? That system is that which defends, that detects, responds, and prevents. And I use this instead of prevent, detect, and respond on purpose. One thing to note here is a little logic exercise. If you can prevent 100% of the attacks out there, do you care about detecting and responding? No, if your firewall doesn't allow any network connections, you don't care about any network-based attacks, right? You don't have to detect and respond to them. Conversely, though, if you were able to detect and respond with 100% efficiency, would you necessarily care about prevention, right? You're like Neo in the Matrix dodging the bullets. You don't need to prevent the guy from shooting because you can dodge every bullet. So it's a very interesting little logic exercise on those. And one that if you take it back and you think about it, you might be able to apply in terms of your processes and people and technology to help become more efficient in defending your network. So the Measured CSO is using metrics to develop and improve the people, process, technology, and to plan, build, manage. We use operate in my organization, but plan, build, and manage that people, process, and technology, as well that we describe as defenses here. Which means that the systems for developing metrics are more important than the systems of dogma that define our standards. And if you actually Google SAT accountant, this is the guy that comes up. Right? That's important that we think about measuring the system being more important than the dogma of things that say thou shalt have really long passwords and thou shalt do all these identity access management hoops and jump through and so forth. Right? There are two systems that we have to worry about across at least 4 audiences. And those are that support the defend, and those that support that plan, build, manage, operate model. So let's talk about defend. My journey on defend starts here. This is Dr. Snow, and Dr. Snow did not buy that cholera a century plus ago. That cholera was because of bad wind, which was the prevailing thought. He didn't buy that at all. And so what he did was he set out, anybody seen the data visualization book, the Tufte book that has this in it? You might recognize this. So what he did was he decided to start mapping it and creating data sets. So every dot is a cholera death and a cholera epidemic in London. And every X, if you can see a handful of X's there, is actually a water pump. Because here you just had a theory that it might be spread by water. And right there, Broad Street, is a water pump. And in fact, it's this water pump here, right? That you can actually go and touch today, or at least you could when they took that picture. And what they found was somebody had built this water pump not 3 meters from a decommissioned cesspool, right? That led to a cholera epidemic. But from that, we get epidemiology, where you talk about risk factors and markers, and you get this wonderful correlation is not causation and so forth. But what epidemiology gave us was the means to find patterns. Dr. Tippett, when he started the DBIR thing, is an actual medical doctor, and the DBIR, if you think about it, is actually an epidemiological look at information security. What we got was, and what they still get today, are a bunch of narratives. First, the bad guy did this, and then he did that, and then there was some escalation of privilege, and then there was a malware installation, and then everybody had a really bad day. That kind of thing was what we would get from the incident response teams. We had to turn that into metrics. We had to turn that information, something that we could process within the context of the population. And so we created a little framework called Verus. Verus is an agent that acts against an asset causing a security attribute, confidentiality, integrity, availability, to be compromised. This comes from a tool that I have internally, and it lists all the different threat agents and actions, and even the vectors of attack. So you have hacking, malware, social, misuse, that's internal, where you give somebody a privilege, physical, error, because error leads to data breaches, and environmental, right? And then here you'll have the reasons for error, the vectors by which the malware came, and so forth. Descriptions of the threat communities above. All metadata to be assigned. These are the asset level ones, so you see things like desktop workstation, laptop, tablet, so forth. What the asset's doing, does it have off creds, is it moving money, and so forth. And so when you take that narrative, you get a pattern, a series of events here. And then you can get patterns in the patterns. So this is actually those threat actions across the top that I just described. Internal, external, or partners. Was it an external threat, an internal threat, or a partner threat? And along the side, you have the assets and the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so you can see, for example, we have one partner worked an error against the server causing a confidentiality breach once within the context of it. So we have patterns, and that also gives us the patterns we saw before. We have a large concentration where a web application happens to fit somewhere in that chain. So the key for a measured CSO system 1 is a framework, data, and models. My organization, we embrace and extend Verus a little bit because Verus is very good at talking about threat actor information, asset information, impact information, but doesn't have a lot of control information in it. And that's mainly because when we did this, the incident response team couldn't sit around and say, how good were your controls, right? They just didn't have time for that. That wasn't part of the bill. Right? The second thing that we've done is we're very, years ago, about 2007, as we started a journey towards data warehousing, at first with Greenplum and now using Hadoop and Apache Storm. And so what we will do is we will actually take all this information in, threat intel feeds, asset information, system logs, and so forth, extract, transform, load, map, reduce, drop it into Hadoop, and then that supports workflows, it supports our analytics, it supports our reporting. So kind of based on these circles here, you'll note there's lots of information out there. I put it in the cloud because everything's in the cloud these days, right? Well, that goes into Hadoop, and there it's stored in a relatively unstructured manner. But when we bring it out based on our models, we can get meaning from it and structure. And in fact, if we're very careful, and we try to be, about ingress and egress points and knowing those and controlling things like our proxy, our IPS, thank you guys. Now you know why I'm buying you drinks, right? Our proxies, our IPS information, our firewalls, and so forth, right? Within the context of machine learning and Apache Storm, we can start taking, and orange is threat and green is asset, we can start looking for indicators of compromise and making decisions, very fast decisions. Because what we're actually doing is taking that pattern, thinking about it as the cyber kill chain. I said cyber, you can all drink. Right. Cyber kill chain, and we're trying to stop it. We're trying to detect, respond, so that we can prevent. Okay. Now, the key to this is enriching the data with as much metadata as possible. So this is some of the metadata that we cover under a vendor SaaS app. And you can see it's everything from the language of the application, the OS that they rely, the operating systems they rely on, who our business owners are, and so forth. Great story, talking to a vendor. Orange 3U box, and they're like, we're a big data solution. I'm like, oh, sweet, big data solution, that's great. Tell me something, big data solution. HR system here, how do I get that information and metadata into your nice 3U orange box? And they looked at me like I was nuts. They're like, why would you care about HR data, all that data up there? And I said, well, because riskiest cost center is actually really useful. The other thing is useful is to understand threat patterns in the context of my business units. A SIM isn't going to tell me that. That's why I like big data orange box guy. And they looked at me again like I was nuts, and they're like, you just keep it in the HR system, which kind of defeats the purpose of big data, but that's neither here nor there. More that those blind leading the blind. So the measured CSO is going to need these three things: the machine learning models, the framework that gives it context, and the data store itself. And the arrows go both ways because there's going to have to be feedback loops. You're going to have to modify and update your models, use model selection. You're going to have to continue to look for data based on what your models and frameworks are telling you where you may have gaps. Your frameworks are going to be updated. You're seeing stuff that you cannot describe. You're going to have to add to it. And it's important to note that, and Deming and Travis and others were very keen on this. They described just looking at past history metrics as trying to drive a truck by only looking in the rearview mirror. That you have to deal with real, anticipated, or forecasted. Okay, so mobile malware might not be a big deal in data breaches today. Is it going to be a big deal in 5 years? I don't know. But I ought to start forecasting for that. Why? So that I can get investment. So, and that investment comes to us in plan, build, and manage. Right? So measured CSO must also include a keen understanding of the partnership with IT and operations, and let me explain why, thanks to this gentleman named Ron Howard who works at Stanford, and he came up with what's called a micromort. Anybody heard of a micromort? Couple folks, right? So a micromort is a 1 in a million chance of death, and so you've got all these wonderful things here. So if you travel 6 miles by a motorbike, you get a 1 in a million chance of death. Congratulations. Traveling 1,000 miles by jet by accident, or traveling 12,000 miles by jet in the US, terrorism, right? Just assigning micromorts. Or you can look at it this way: if you go hang gliding, you get 8 micromorts. You go out for dinner with Chris John Riley, you're going to get about 15, 16. Modern risk management is really good at figuring out when fate will intercede on your bicycle ride and cause you to have a bad time. We are okay at describing a singular micromort. We're not so good when you combine more than one factor. So if you are if you're on X and you're on a bicycle, now you've got some more micromorts. We're even worse when the bicyclist himself isn't really in shape or practices bad habits. You had a guy smoking on his bike, and this guy's obviously ready for the Tour de France. Also missing out of that context is when you're just plain stupid. So the measured CSO must know where IT is overweight, smoking ecstasy. I know you don't smoke ecstasy, but bear with me. Smoking ecstasy while riding on a rocket-powered bicycle on the railing of a bridge. Right? If you don't know that that's going on, if you don't have that context, right, then your partnership with IT is going to be bad, and you're going to have probably a bad day because you're dependent on their quality in order to defend your enterprise. And we actually have some data that infers this, thanks to this gentleman, Gene King, in the Visible Ops series, for those who are familiar with Visible Ops. Gene's now way on his DevOps kick, and he'd be happy to talk to you about that. But this, while old, is a fantastic read if you haven't read it all already. So, a little bit of wrapping up. Data, and analysis, metadata. That will help you with your understand what is going on in IT, why your change management process sucks, why you can't be DevOpsy just yet as an organization. So I'm becoming measured. What does that mean? I do, one of the things I get to do is IONS research. And there I give metric symposiums and CISO forums. And I talk to people across the United States, had probably insight into about 100 or so different security programs. And I'm here to tell you that most metrics programs are a lot like this, where we're gathering some information, and it just isn't, I see somebody just got it. We're gathering information, and we don't have context, and therefore the meaning that we're getting out of it is useless. And it's a little bit like thinking about a metric as an individual Lego. A metric is one Lego, but that Lego is useless until you give it some context, right? So it's a little Lego now here in this little diorama, right, that we might think about as our security program, whose broader context is the whole of IT. Now, unless you're using a framework and unless you're using a model, right, you end up looking more like my living room. I have 5 kids. You end up looking more like my living room and having a bad day than you actually giving them a really nice diorama, a model, Lego model, right, and what have you. So how does the measured CSO get context? All right, so who here has heard of gold question metric? Renee. Okay, so you can't leave DeepSec and say, I didn't learn anything that I can't use tomorrow in my job because I'm about to teach you this. This is fun. This guy's Vic Basili, right? And Vic built goal question metrics as a means to develop metrics in software development. And what you do is you have some goals that you describe. And your goal might be secure the network. It might be train my people. It might be try to keep your zipper up. Whatever your goal is, you've got a goal. Then you ask yourself questions. Well, you know, how will I know if I generally keep my zipper up or not? Or how do I know what my software quality is, and so forth. And then you look for metrics that support or infer those. You're not creating a model that's risk equals threat times vulnerability impact. You're actually going out and saying, do I have quality software or not? Right? Because I have a pattern that shows me that that's one way to have a really bad day. So you have data and you have some models and therefore you have some execution. I'll give you an example of using goal question metric to develop a scorecard. Goal question metric. Sometimes I'll mention sometimes the same question can answer multiple goals, sometimes the same metric will answer multiple questions and so forth. So one of the things that I have to do is have a good conversation with my patch management team. And so what we did was we created a GQM-based scorecard, and I'll just walk through you a couple of the branches. Our goals for patch management. Well, it's got to be comprehensive, right? If we have little bits and pieces that we don't patch, it's going to suck. Second, it has to be timely, right? Critical patches have to be done in a critical amount of time. Medium patches have to be done in a medium amount of time, whatever that means, and so forth. It has to be cost efficient. We can't spend more patching systems than we actually stand to lose. So we start asking ourselves questions about comprehensiveness, because our first goal is comprehensive, right? Well, do we have a % coverage by business units? How about by asset category, like Windows servers, Unix servers, and so forth? What it means to be comprehensive? Well, we might want to look at comprehensive coverage by risk, by likelihoods and asset categories, by impacts, partnering with BCBDR and getting BIA information. Right? We also might want to look at where month over month our most significant failures are based on risk. Right? If patches don't happen to my treasury systems, I'm going to have a bad day. Right? Repeat offenders. Is there somebody out there, and somebody maybe in Unix land, or maybe it's the desktop people who just ain't patching well? Anybody have Flash on the desktop? Timely. What should our priorities be for timeliness? Well, what is the time to patch for assets with worse likelihoods? Right? And so things that might be in my DMZ, for example. What's our policy for timeliness? Well, we have to know that. If we're going to say timely, that's at medium, and that high and that low and critical and so forth. And what other considerations might we have? We ask that. The last one, what cost efficient? Hour per asset spent patching. It's a great metric, right? By asset category, by cost per hour. By location, how much does it cost us to patch systems in the DMZ versus patch all my desktops? There are two totally different cost factors that both relate to my exact risk. Risk reduction, right? Is it cost efficient because where are we reducing risk? So hour per asset by annualized loss expectancy from our risk register per hour per asset category, those sorts of things. So we can use these within the context of historical values, triggers, thresholds, and so forth to create a very nice scorecard that I can walk into a meeting with patch management and say, hi, let's talk about why we suck, or let's talk about where we're doing good, or whatever, right? And in this case, because we're talking about a bunch of indicators about the complex system, now Frederick Hayek is really happy with us. You can even use this sort of thing if you're beholden to the NIST cybersecurity framework like I am. So US National Institute of Standards and Technology has this wonderful thing for critical infrastructure called the cybersecurity framework. In fact, there's a meeting in Brussels on Monday that I'm not attending at all that talks where people in Europe are going to talk to people in the United States about how this is wonderful or it's not so good or what have you, right? But it's NIST cybersecurity framework, and these are supposedly the things that now the US Department of Treasury is talking to my bank about and giving this context to our conversations. So, becoming measured. Just to wrap up. Framework, models, data, metadata, contexts. ETL and store all the things. We have dedicated ETL folks for security and fraud who just ETL systems. Just in the name of fraud and security, I claim this database and we're going to suck it into Hadoop and you're just going to like it. And we might even use that, but at least it'll be there. And so at this point, we're 2 petabytes and growing of information around that. It looks like this with that context, right? ETL map reduce that supports our workflows, those things that Deming called the people, process, and technology that the CSO, Deming says the CSO is beholden to improve. We can use it to defend our network. We can use it to plan, build, and operate. And if you do not know how to ask the right question, you're going to discover nothing, which is why the frameworks and formalities of data collection beat the frameworks and formalities of the audit industrial complex any day of the week. Here's a link to a bunch of resources. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I hope you enjoyed it.
So are there any questions to Alex?
Compared to the US, the Austrian industry is very small scale, and the typical company in Austria is something about 20 to 40, maybe 100 employees. How much of all this scales down to small companies?
Small companies, the amount of effort that small companies will put into something like this corresponds to the risk that they have. There's no reason why a small company can't use simple GQM-based scorecards. There's no reason why a small company can't use Mongo and target specific information. But that may be too much. Maybe it's not. When I worked with a red team as a consultant, across the street from us was a box company. And I always wondered about the day that the cardboard box company was going to really care about security. And the fact of the matter is they just may never, right? And so to answer your question, small companies in the US may not care about this. Big companies may. But if the big companies partake in something like a scientific endeavor and they share information, then at some point that information can impact and can help a small company.
Further questions? I think Aaron was first.
Hi, it's very interesting, thanks. One thing came to my mind while listening to your talk. In German we have the nice phrase, wer misst, 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 which roughly translates to he who measures automatically measures wrong. Which is, in a sense, true. It's very, very philosophical. It goes back to whatever, Heisenberg, whatever, yeah? But, the question for me is, working at a national cert, our measurement area would be the Austrian internet. And we discovered that there is lots of uncertainties about certain metrics that we would like to use. And maybe you could share some experiences about how to improve your measurements over time, because
Sure.
I think that's the crucial step.
So I'll start with, of course, your metrics are always wrong. That's part of scientific theory. Your metrics, the meaning, the context is a hypothesis. Your hypothesis, most of your hypotheses ought to get disproved. If they're not, then they turn into dogma pretty quickly, and you end up with a BlackBerry with a strong password, right? So the first part of your question, I'm going to absolutely agree with, but say without that feedback loop, without applying a scientific model and falsifying and throwing, I would never throw away data, but throwing away the model that is incorrect and building a new one, yeah, absolutely. The second piece of your question, remind me again, a little jet lagged. Oh, okay, yeah. So it was actually measurement theory. So Myron Tribus, the guy who, when I read that stuff off of my little Google tablet, right, he was actually very famous for applying Bayesian methods to engineering and to business. He was one of the first folks, thanks to his work in thermodynamics and working with E.T. Jaynes and quantum mechanics. He was one of the first people to actually say, whoa, Bayes' theorem actually works in all sorts of other places, why don't we try it? If you get real subjective in your Bayesianism and you read things like Doug Hubbard's How to Measure Everything and so forth, then you'll understand about calibrating estimates. It sucks, it's not magic, it doesn't turn garbage into useful stuff into the system, but it helps you at least set parameters, and it helps you find where you might be able to do more. Sometimes the information just isn't there. Sometimes our forecasts are exactly that. They're forecasts and they're terrible. Again, none of this is unicorn turds. What this is the application of scientific method. And so what I would say is, when you're confronted with uncertainties, there are many elements of science that have to deal with uncertainties, right? Who here has touched a T-Rex? I heard that story last night. I had nightmares. Yeah, so that's what I would say. My explanation for you there.
So I'm afraid we have to stop now because the first talks are waiting. It's already 5 minutes past. We don't want to steal too much time. So the talks will be just diagonal on the left and right pirouette. Thank you very much.
Thank you.